So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to listen to me talk about Haskell, or kind of more specifically, my journey into Haskell. I have been working as a software engineer for about 3 years, since 2015. First of all, as a closure engineer in a variety of kind of e-commerce and fintech-esque companies. And then I recently started learning Haskell for a new job about a year and a half ago, May last year. So this will be a talk about my learning journey of understanding and learning Haskell in order to be able to work with it. So it's, in some ways, I think Haskell the hard way, in that I kind of started off with zero knowledge of Haskell and was learning in a short space of time in order to be able to work with it professionally. So I should start off by saying what I'm not here to do is convince you that you should learn Haskell or to work with Haskell. Obviously, we've had some fantastic talks over the last couple of days across a variety of languages and paradigms and stuff. So I'm going to trust in your own judgment to pick up Haskell if you're already interested in it, or this is an overall my kind of learning journey over maybe the first few months of learning Haskell. So things that I've learned, ways of learning, and information that I can pass on to you, hopefully, as well as a few observations on the general Haskell ecosystem and tooling and community that I think we can make improvements on. So why is it? So I want to achieve two things. Hopefully, get a useful kind of beginner's perspective on learning Haskell, which I think is super important because we talk about. Is that working? There we go. So we occasionally talk about the Haskell Pyramid. If any of you have been following kind of any Haskell users on Twitter or people that are involved in the Haskell community on Twitter, the Haskell Pyramid, which I realize is not actually a pyramid, comes up quite often in terms of, this is supposedly illustrating that in order to work with Haskell, in order to kind of understand and enjoy and be productive with Haskell, this is kind of a level of knowledge that you need to know. There's a very sort of small amount of material that you need to understand and you need to learn in order to be able to enjoy Haskell for what it is, whether that's as a hobbyist or a professional. What's discussed on social networks, and I think, in talks and settings like this, are things that are kind of on the periphery and on the, pushing the absolute borders of what Haskell can do. So this is cutting edge research, this is, all of the kind of fancy type stuff, which is super useful and amazing fun to work with, but actually isn't entirely necessary for you as a Haskell beginner to get started and to get enjoying the language proper. The second thing I want to do is again make some observations on the community, which I think is super important because I think we should improve it as we go along, right? I think we talk about improving and refactoring code as we go, and always leaving a code base nicer than you found it. I think it's important for us to do the same with the community. So as we come into the Haskell community, leaving it nicer and more accessible and more friendly to newcomers than we found it. And I think this is useful because it helps us to improve the overall quality of the community as a whole and its output when we have more people that are able to participate in using Haskell and working with it. So, getting started with Haskell, I think my Haskell journey was a little bit unusual in the sense that I started learning Haskell after I accepted a job in it. So that was it was a bit nerve-wracking. I was working as a closure developer at an e-commerce company when I got, an old colleague got in touch with me about a role at a large, big international bank, working primarily with Haskell and PureScript, and developing tools, so continuous integration and deployment infrastructure and tooling for their team of quantitative developers. It was working with a very small team on a relatively kind of greenfield project with people with a ton of experience. I thought, okay, this is great. This is a fantastic learning opportunity for me. The worst thing that can happen here is that I leave this having learned and having come out with more than I started with, and maybe learning from the amazing professionals around me and having learned, and worked with Haskell. Alternatively, I could do an awful job and be ostracized from the community forever, but I didn't really think about that at the time. So having accepted the job at this very large bank to work with Haskell, I thought, okay, well, how do I get started learning Haskell? I had some fantastic advice from one of the people that I'd be working with. So it was to develop a small application using a few libraries that achieved a thing. This was primarily in Haskell and PureScript, and specifically starting with PostgreSDB. So we have some data in a DB that we want to surface using Haskell types that we know and love. So we want to use, they gave me some specific libraries to use, so Esquelito to use queries and pull some information from a Postgres database, stored in using Haskell types, and then using a combination of Servant, which is kind of a type-safe, DSL for describing type-safe APIs, and PureScript Bridge to surface some information by generating PureScript types from our Haskell types, surfacing some information on the front end. So imagine your typical small project, like a to-do checklist or a very small web application. So that was the kind of thing, that was the kind of project that I got started with. And this was the kind of stack that we'd be using at work, right? So we're using Postgres, Haskell, and PureScript. As us long-term professionals use as an acronym PHP, as we know and love. So this was fantastic advice, and this was fantastic advice because it has all of the things that you, if any of you have taken like a management course as part of your roles, I don't know why you would, but it has all of the features of like a good goal setting. So they're measurable, achievable, and specific. I was told to use specific libraries that we'd be using at work, and in order to be able to, in sort of a short time, specified time, to deliver a project that kind of, by the end of which I will have learned enough to sort of get started and hit the ground running in the new role. At the same time, I had some other really interesting advice when I told some of my colleagues that I'd be going to work with Haskell. Before I learn Haskell, learn category theory, but not category theory for programmers because it's not academically rigorous enough, which was very interesting advice, but also what I would class as not very good advice, right? Because it has the opposite of the features that I described before. It wasn't particularly specific. It's told me exactly what not to do, but it doesn't provide me with any kind of guidance as to what type of category theory to start looking at, right? It's, do I do category, I know I shouldn't do category theory for programmers, which seems like the most sensible thing. Do I do category theory for, I don't know, like builders or something? What other kinds of category theories, like topics and stuff are there? It's not particularly measurable. It's kind of tangential to my learning goal, which is understanding Haskell enough to apply it to a production environment. And this was saying, before you do any of that, learn this whole other, humongous domain before you actually learn the thing that you've come, the thing that your main goal. So the last thing I'd point out at this point was that I thought this was this whole way of describing things. We shouldn't do category theory for programmers because it's less academically rigorous. Had no basis in experience, right? This person I think had come from a closure background, hadn't worked with Haskell yet, hadn't worked with category theory yet, but was offering this kind of relatively unsolicited advice. I was like, thank you, great. When you go off and learn Haskell and work with it, I'd be more than happy to accept your advice. But I also found this a little bit sort of contemptuous against the kind of category theory for programmers by kind of describing it as lesser. We're sort of trying to, it sounded like we were trying to insult it a little bit. And it reminded me actually of something that Oren Shaw spoke about. She's written some really fantastic blogs on something called contempt culture, which I see quite a lot in, which I've seen quite a lot so far in the software engineering communities, but also a little bit in the Haskell community, which is the idea that we show contempt for other tools, other languages, other operating systems, in order to gain social currency into the group that we're in. So, for example, we have conversations about statically versus dynamically typed languages, Vim versus Emacs, which operating systems we use, that aren't fundamentally like balanced conversations. They're just, this language is crap. And we do that in order to be able to, I suppose, associate ourselves more closely with in-group, right? We all want to be part of this in-group of functional programmers that kind of associate ourselves with maybe one tool or another, which I think possibly is a problem in itself. But I don't know if any of you have ever heard or been part of a conversation. If you raise your hands, if you've sort of heard the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So X language is awful, or X tooling is awful, with kind of no basis or no reasoned argument behind it, right? We're just kind of saying these things that we feel more comfortable in this in-group. So the first time I gave this talk, I didn't explain this very well, and I got this response. Again, just to reiterate, this is not having a reasoned argument about the pros and cons of languages, right? Or the pros and cons of specific tools, or the pros and cons of ways of building things. And I think a good marker to understand whether you're participating in contempt culture is one, has the person that you've had that conversation with, or the person that you're trying to sell X language or X tool to, come out learning something about the pros and cons of either side. If I say that, if I have a discussion about Clojure versus Haskell, I can talk about the benefits and drawbacks of dynamically typed versus statically typed languages, and that's absolutely fine. Like, I can advocate for one thing or the other dependent on how someone wants to apply it. But the main thing is that person's come out having learned something about the domain that you're trying to convince them about. And secondly, do you feel more smug as an outcome of that conversation, right? If you feel a little bit smug, you're probably participating in contempt culture. So this is something that I've seen a little bit of in the Haskell community, if I'm honest. And what I wanted to say about this was contempt culture isn't representative of the Haskell community. And I think as someone joining it for the first time, it was a bit of a shocker to me to have people be so dismissive of the tools and things that I'd worked with, because I think it has broader implications, and that we identify I think sometimes as developers we identify quite closely with the tools that we use, right? This is almost part of our identity as competent programmers. We bind our professional competence quite closely with the tools that we use and the ways that we build things. And by participating in contempt culture, what you're not only saying is that actually the tool that you're using is bad, or the language that you're using is bad, but that has an impact on you as a developer, and that's reflective of you as a developer, which I think can be incredibly hostile to newcomers. So I've seen a little bit of that in the Haskell community, a tiny bit, and I think it's not just in the Haskell community, right? And this isn't representative of the Haskell community. There are some fantastic conversations and super encouraging people I've met as part of the sort of online channels in terms of Slack or IRC and things like that. This is by no means representative of the Haskell industry, the Haskell ecosystem and community, but I think it applies to functional programming and I think software engineering more generally. So just be aware of the times that you might be participating in contempt culture, and instead of saying X language is bad or X tool is bad, maybe try having a reasoned discussion based on your own experience that isn't just condensed down to, oh, well, that's a bit crap, because it can be very dismissive and I think be very discouraging to people from other communities. So having experienced this a little bit, I just decided actually to take myself out of that space a little bit, and just thought, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to start my own sort of mini learning group. And I would say that Haskell Programming for First Principles, if you haven't read it already, and if you're interested in learning Haskell, is a fantastic beginner resource. So I started a very small study and reading group based on this book. And I would also, if you're interested in learning Haskell for the first time, I would definitely recommend going on to the Functional Programming Slack channel and the Haskell, Functional Programming Slack group and the Haskell book channel, where they have a ton of people asking loads of questions and providing support around getting further through the book. So it's kind of a mini reading group in itself. So that was my approach to kind of just ignoring contempt culture to start off with. But I guess to summarize, if you kind of recognize that you're participating in that culture, just be aware that it provides a really poor experience to newcomers. And if you experience it, it's not reflective of the community that you're a part of. But challenge it where you see it. I would absolutely encourage you to do that. So, having spent a small amount of time, a very small amount of time, I spent a month developing a small project, understanding and learning Haskell syntax and core concepts, and kind of feeling a little bit more confident and kind of ready to head into the world of professional work as a Haskeller. So I started my first day at this bank in May 2017, May of last year. Had a fantastic first day getting set up, getting my machine set up, doing a bit of compliance stuff, cloning all of the repos that I needed and getting everything up and running. The first task that I had to do was surfacing some information, again, very closely tied to the stuff that I'd been working on for my project, surfacing some information from a Postgres database into the front end, so we could see some extra information about test run times that the developers, around the tests that the developers were running. So what I needed to do as part of that was access and modify something in a deeply nested data structure. And if you've worked with Haskell, you can probably envision what's coming up next. So I know how to access deeply nested data structures very well from Clojure. This is a really simple, contrived example of how you might do something like this in Clojure, right? So I have a nested map here, ABC, where my map contains B with a key value pair that represents B and something else that represents a key value pair of C. If I want to get the string C, all I need to run in Clojure is get in the map that I want to, the nested map, and then provide the list of vector of keys that allow me to, that are a pathway to the thing that I want to access. Fantastic. Haskell's a little bit more verbose because we get the added benefits of the kind of the type system, and this is, we get a few more assurances about the output of our code. And that the inputs and outputs are going to be correct and our assumptions are valid. But I've defined exactly the same thing here. So I've defined a nested data structure. I've written it slightly differently. So A contains B, B contains C. I've added a language extension that allows me to write things in this kind of format, so I don't have to explicitly bind the value contains C to the symbol contains C. This basically just means this map. So I have exactly the same nested what's a record here. And I know that I can use a standard record access syntax to compose my functions on ABC, so I can jump into B, jump into the thing that contains B, jump into the thing that contains C, and then grab the value at C here. So I'm doing exactly the same thing. Fantastic. What if I then want to modify the thing in a nested structure? So I use a lot of sparkles in my tweets. Sparkle emojis, which haven't quite come out right, but I want to concatenate this sparkle emoji onto whatever I've accessed in my nested data structure. In Clojure, we do that in a very similar way. We change our getIn function to updateIn, which kind of is self-explanatory. We provide the same path, and then we provide a function that says, okay, given the string that I've just passed you, append my sparkles, right? And that gives me the thing that's highlighted at the bottom. How do I do that in Haskell? Does anyone know what's coming here? So as part of this first task, like I was saying, surfacing some information on the front end for our developers to see how long their longest running tests, I needed to modify a value in a nested data structure, which you can do quite simply in Clojure here. In Haskell, however, you have to access the dreaded lens library. And actually, I'm being a bit mean here because the lens library is a fantastic way of accessing, modifying, and combining multiple functions to, in a very powerful and expressive way, access very kind of arbitrarily complex data structures. It is a fantastic library, but its documentation leaves a little bit to be desired. So imagine, if you will, that you're a beginner with about a month's worth of Haskell experience, and this is the introduction that you see. For what it's worth, I gave a similar, kind of more ranty talk than this at the Haskell Exchange a couple of weeks ago, and the vast majority of the room of Haskell practitioners and hobbyists raised their hands and said that this was one of the most intimidating pieces of documentation that they've encountered in the Haskell ecosystem to date. So this is probably a good example of how not to do good documentation. It's also, it wasn't just me that found this daunting. Actually, documentation is the second biggest gripe in the whole of the Haskell community, according to the State of Haskell survey last year. The first was the ability to, I think, choose between libraries, which I think is very strongly linked to how well these libraries are documented, right? Okay, so we acknowledge that as a community, we could probably improve our documentation. How can we do that? And how can you, as a possibly interested Haskeller, get involved in improving our documentation? I came across a blog post that outlined, or that made the distinction between hard and soft documentation. Soft documentation style is on the left, hard documentation style is on the right. I think Haskell is great at hard documentation, right? We know how to provide some pretty solid type annotations, right, to describe the inputs and outputs of our function and what they're doing, which assumes you know kind of, I suppose, the type system in depth, which you might not as a beginner. I think is fine. You're learning things as you go along. So hard documentation provides type signatures, function descriptions, and basically anything that can be used to automatically generate documents using something like Haddock. So comments and things like that. I think one thing that we can improve, a few things that we can improve on are the kind of things outlined in the soft documentation style. So one thing I noticed that the library didn't have was actually the problem that we're trying to solve with, for example, the Lens library. Why is it that I would want to use the Lens library over, the few smaller examples that I can see elsewhere in the Haskell ecosystem? How do I get set up with this? How do I run some small examples to get a feel for the core functions? How, why, when, and when not do I use this particular library? I think probably the example that I showed, just kind of accessing and modifying a kind of not too heavily nested, not too deeply nested data structure is probably one of the simplest problems that the Lens library attempts to solve. It might well be that the library was too complicated for my needs, but I could only get that from this type signature. I can only determine that from feeling that feeling in the pit of my stomach that made me feel as though I had no idea what I was doing, but when I was looking at this part of the documentation. So that's kind of a bit of a driver away from using this library. But actually, fundamentally, what I wanted to understand was, will this help me solve the problem, or will this help me achieve this particular thing? In which case, accessing and modifying nested data structures. Terminology, both library-specific and things that are specific to the library and things that are just general Haskell terms, would be super useful. And contribution guidelines, FAQs and tutorials, etc. These might be overkill if you just have a very small project, but I think once you start getting a kind of critical mass of users, it's really, really important to think about how we can provide soft documentation or better documentation to our users to encourage them to use our libraries and our packages. I'd like to see a show of hands, actually. Who's written a library? Who's written a library or a package or some kind of open source thing before? Fantastic. Keep your hands up if you've written that thing without documentation to start with, just because it was like a pet project, right? No one's going to use it. Okay, yeah. Keep your hands up if you've then started getting a ton of users and you're like, and retrospectively started adding the documentation in. Fantastic. This is good. This is good. And this is fine, right? This is the natural evolution of projects and of open source and documentation. I think writing documentation is hard, right? I never want to do a disservice to the amazing work that we do in the kind of open source community and opening up the work that we do to be used by the wider programming community. But no one really likes writing documentation. So is there a way that we can make it easier for other people to contribute to our projects as they're using them? And so kind of get that benefit of both the user's perspective and maybe the beginner's perspective, and the questions that they have and the frequently asked, the frequent issues or things like that, and use that, I suppose, beginner knowledge and perspective to improve your own library documentation. There are some great examples elsewhere in the programming community. So Lexi Lambda, I don't actually know what her real name is, but her handle is Lexi Lambda, suggests Racket Lens as a great example of documentation. It's covering the same thing, but is much less imposing to people using the library for the first time, and it provides all of the things that I mentioned before in terms of soft documentation, which is, why do we want to use the thing in the first place? What problems does it solve? It provides gradually more and more complicated or gradually larger and larger examples as well, so that you can take those and build a better intuition for what the library does in the core functions. And I think this also provides a ton of explanations around both library specific, or I suppose concept specific, and Haskell terminology, or links where it's not really appropriate to fill out to describe simple concepts. Haskell has some great documentation as well. This is a fantastic example of, this is a tutorial rather than documentation, but it's an example of actually someone empathizing with their library users and saying, we don't have enough information here. And Gabriel Gonzalez wrote a shell script library called Turtle that not only has fantastic documentation, but has a very extensive tutorial as well. So the only thing I would say here is, I suppose it's a kind of, once your library starts gaining critical mass of users, it's super, super important to start, fleshing out documentation, even providing tutorials if that feels appropriate. Equally, if you're contributing to something, don't be put off by, I suppose, the size of a library in terms of creating pull requests for contributions and trying to improve, if you can see that improvements can be made to the documentation. Elm has a fantastic range of resources on writing great documentation and design guidelines and writing libraries as well. So if there's anything actually that you see that you're a little bit unsure about contributing to and you're not quite sure how you can help, actually the Elm guidelines are a great start, and I kind of wish we had something like this in Haskell. I haven't seen this yet, but this would be a fantastic start. So it kind of feels as though we know how to write good documentation, we know how to write good packages and libraries. Why isn't this a solved problem already in Haskell, and what can we do? What can we do to fix it? It's very easy for me to say, oh yeah, you should just contribute if you feel like it, or raise a PR, or we should generally improve documentation. But how can we actually actively encourage contribution in a sensible and constructive way? This was one of the pieces of feedback to, again, the State of Haskell survey. And it kind of there are a few other answers like this that kind of gave the impression that it can be a bit daunting contributing to projects or open source projects in general. And it feels like maybe that's a little bit more pronounced in the Haskell community. So how can we better encourage contribution? What examples are there of fantastic, I suppose, mentorship and contribution initiatives? So we're nearing the end of October now, but Hacktoberfest has been running this entire month, which is where you list. There's a ton of open source projects that you can contribute to that often have tags that highlight where something's really appropriate for beginners, and that's looking at a load of projects looking for contribution. This website in particular highlights a load of Haskell-specific projects. There's a link at the bottom, I'll share the slides afterwards. It's a really, really fantastic resource. Even though we're nearing the end of October, we're nearing the end of Hacktoberfest, there's absolutely no reason. These projects are still going to need contribution, right? So there's no reason that you can't have a look on here and create a pull request sometime over the next few months. These people always also offer mentorship as well. So if you're interested in learning Haskell and getting the kind of advice and professional experience of long-term Haskellers, this is a great place to start, and I would encourage you to have a look at that. Google Summer of Code also, as of last year, I think also now has Haskell projects in, which is fantastic. Many of you may not be students, but it may still be worth a look, because they have a ton of research ideas that can be implemented in Haskell that people are interested in expanding on. So if you're interested in the sort of the research side of Haskell, this is definitely worth a look. To at least, if nothing else, give you some ideas as to how you can contribute to Haskell research and projects. So overall, the thing that I want to emphasize here is that I acknowledge that, and I think as a Haskell community, we acknowledge that there are some parts of our ecosystem that aren't the most accessible. We acknowledge that our documentation is pretty bad. We acknowledge that actually I think both in Haskell and the functional programming community and in the software engineering community as a whole, there can be that sort of culture of contempt, and I think that's something that is normal. Kind of, we're social creatures, and I think that's an attempt for us to kind of fit into an in-group. So I would say that despite some of these, I think, potentially barriers to accessing the Haskell community and ecosystem, I would absolutely encourage you to have a look through some of these resources if you are interested in learning Haskell or working with Haskell. I think the best way that we can improve the community and the ecosystem as a whole is to better encourage contribution from people as they're learning Haskell and as they're facing the pain of some of the libraries or the documentation. And actually, I would absolutely encourage you to raise a PR, contribute if you can, and I think that's the way that we'll improve our community. So newbie and beginner contributions are absolutely welcomed and needed. That was it. I've also put together a list of resources. I'll share these slides afterwards. So it's kind of an opinionated list of resources from beginner to advanced, so roughly in order of how I've been approaching them, and based on, again, a ton of other much more experienced Haskellers saying, okay, well, this resource is fantastic. Some of them have been a bit out. I've excluded the ones that are outdated or that don't necessarily work, so it's quite an opinionated guide on Haskell learning as of 2018. Fantastic. Any questions?